A black truck pulls into the farm. Takeshi's hands freeze. After 2 years of running, of building invisibly, of teaching his twins that safety means staying hidden, he's found them. The alpha who called him replaceable stands in the Oregon dirt, looking different, thinner, broken, and Takeshi's body betrays him. His pheromones shift. His Omega instinct recognizes something it shouldn't. Not danger. Something worse. Possibility. The man who destroyed him is asking for one thing, a chance, and Takeshi is terrified he might actually give it. His children are watching. His new life is fracturing. The alpha walks toward him with an expression that says he finally understands what he threw away. But how can an Omega who escaped survive going back to the person who broke him? How did we get here? This is where the real story begins. Love this story? The full audio drama continues on Patreon, where you can access extended scenes, bonus content, and early releases. Support creators like us, link in description. Tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories like this. The worst part about being replaceable is that nobody tells you until you already know it yourself. Takeshi Nakamori stood in the parking garage at 6 in the morning with 2 empty car seats stacked in his arms and a text message that had arrived at 3 a.m. saying simply, "We need to talk about the future." Not his future, the future, as though he existed somewhere outside the orbit of whatever Damien was planning next. The car seats were custom, Danish design, cost more than his first apartment, installed with the precision of someone who understood that tiny bodies required absolute safety. He'd chosen them himself while Damien was in meetings. He'd researched them the way he researched everything that concerned the twins. Every material choice, every safety rating, every small decision that meant his sons wouldn't spend their lives in danger the way their father had. Takeshi was 27 years old. Omega. Second-generation immigrant. First-generation invisible to everyone except the one person he couldn't afford to see him clearly. He'd spent the last 4 years building a life that looked like it had value from the outside. Penthouse apartment in downtown Seattle. Designer wardrobe. Access to the kind of money that came with a signature and a pheromone-matched alpha who owned half the Pacific Northwest's underground economy. From the outside, Takeshi Nakamori looked like he'd won the genetic lottery and then doubled down by landing Damien Voss. From the inside, he was a secondary in a primary's world, which meant he was useful right up until the moment someone more useful came along. The car seats went into the trunk of his vintage Volvo. Not Damien's cars, never Damien's cars. Takeshi had learned early to keep separate things, separate bank accounts, separate phone numbers that only rang with his own business, separate identities that Damien's world didn't touch. He'd learned because he'd watched his mother do it, watched her hide pieces of herself away like squirrels burying nuts for a winter that never came, just in case. His mother had married an alpha, had 3 children, had learned to small herself down until she fit inside the boxes he'd drawn around her life. She died still trying to make sense of a man who'd told her she was necessary, the same way a business is necessary. You keep it running until you replace it with something better. The text had come through at 3 a.m. Damien at a poker game with the Volkov family heads, probably, or the Chen contingent, somewhere with cigarette smoke and older alphas and drinks that cost more than philosophy. Takeshi had read it and felt something crack. Not shatter. Cracks were too dramatic. This was the sound of something fundamental settling, shifting, realigning into a new configuration that didn't include him except as an afterthought. The penthouse was empty when he got back. Damien had gone from the game to the office. That was his pattern. 20 hours awake, 6 hours unconscious on the couch in his private suite, then back to the world of deals and violence and the slow accumulation of power that required constant feeding. Takeshi knew the schedule like he knew the rhythm of his own heartbeat because he'd built his life around it, arranged himself to be available in the margins, necessary in the spaces where Damien had nothing else to fill. 4 years of that. 2 children who had his eyes and Damien's pheromone signature. 2 car seats that would never see the inside of this apartment again. He moved through the space like a ghost, like he was haunting it instead of having built it. The twins' room was the last place he went. Both cribs, pushed together because they'd been born holding hands and Takeshi couldn't bear to separate them even in sleep. Rowan, the elder by 3 minutes, slept with his fist curled against his chest like he was already braced for disappointment. Sawyer, the younger, slept with his mouth open, trusting the world to keep him alive. Takeshi stood between the cribs and felt his entire life bifurcate into before and after. Before the text message, he'd been building something. A life. a family. A foundation that was supposed to be permanent because he'd made it permanent, had ground his teeth and small-talked with Damien's associates, and learned to read the room like it was a contract written in pheromones and power dynamics. After the text message, he was building an escape route. He'd packed the first bag at 3:15 a.m., moving silently through the penthouse, gathering the documents that mattered: birth certificates, passports, the offshore account information that his mother's lawyer had pressed into his hands 5 years ago with a look that said, "You'll need this." He'd packed the second bag by 4, filled with clothes that were old enough not to be missed immediately. He'd called the car service that knew not to send bills to the penthouse address. By 5, everything he could carry was in the trunk of the Volvo except the twins, whom he was about to wake from the only home they'd ever known. The thing about Omega instincts is that they're designed to protect and preserve, which means the moment Takeshi touched Rowan's forehead, his pheromones shifted, not panicked, never panicked, but urgent. The biological scent of an Omega in protection mode, signaling danger to his own bloodline. Rowan woke instantly because he was tuned to his father's pheromones the way the moon is tuned to tides. His dark eyes focused on Takeshi's face, and there was no confusion, no grogginess, just the immediate alertness of a child whose Omega parent had taught him that waking up fast could mean living through things. Sawyer followed seconds later, still soft with sleep, reaching for Takeshi the way he did every morning. Takeshi lifted both of them, one on each hip, and felt them mold against his body with the ease of children who had never questioned whether they belonged there. Their scents bloomed, still baby soft, not yet differentiated into alpha or beta or omega, just the pure, undiluted pheromone signature of his own children, his own blood, his own unquestionable proof of mattering in a world that had spent his entire life suggesting otherwise. The car seats went in with the precision of muscle memory. The twins buckled with their tiny hands, grasping for each other across the gap between them. Takeshi sat in the driver's seat and stared at the Seattle skyline, just starting to burn orange with the approaching dawn, and thought about what it meant to be replaceable. His phone buzzed. Damien. Finally awake. The message was short. "Come to the office. We should discuss this in person." As though Takeshi had options. As though coming or not coming would fundamentally alter the calculus of a man who made decisions about people the way other men made decisions about real estate. He started the car instead. He did not go to the office. He did not go to the penthouse. He did not respond to the next 3 messages that came through in rapid succession, each one declining in urgency because Damien was the kind of alpha who believed that other people should rearrange themselves around his communication timeline, and when they didn't, his first instinct wasn't to chase. It was to assume they'd be back. They always came back. Omegas came back because they were biologically programmed to seek the security of an alpha, and because the world was designed to penalize those who didn't, and because leaving meant admitting that you'd made a catastrophic mistake in your choice of mate, and the social infrastructure didn't allow for Omegas who admitted to mistakes. Except Takeshi had prepared for this the way he'd prepared for everything else, which meant he had a separate identity, a second passport, bank accounts that existed in a jurisdiction that didn't cooperate with extradition requests. A plan. He drove north, away from Seattle, away from the towers where Damien was probably sitting in his office, suddenly aware that the text message he'd sent at 3 a.m. had meant something. That an Omega who'd spent 4 years making himself small had finally decided that small wasn't going to kill him, but staying was. The twins fell asleep before they crossed the bridge into Washington State. Takeshi drove through the dawn with his children unconscious in the back seat and thought about everything he would never be able to explain to them, why their father was never coming, why the apartment disappeared, why the man whose scent they carried in their cells had decided they were replaceable right alongside their mother. Damien Voss would go to the office and find Takeshi's departure had created a blank space in his morning. He would be briefly inconvenienced. He would reach out to his network and discover that Takeshi had vanished completely. Erased himself with the precision of someone who'd been planning this his entire life, which he had. The scandal would be manageable. An Omega who'd left her alpha for another Omega or a beta, probably. Someone more suitable. Someone who'd realized that a syndicate boss was too much to handle. The papers might mention it as a footnote. The syndicates would discuss it as a security breach that revealed Takeshi had been operating more autonomously than Damien had realized, which would wound his pride more than the abandonment ever could. But Damien would move on. Within 6 months, There would be another Omega in the penthouse. Someone younger, probably. Someone who didn't carry the weight of raising twins or the exhaustion of trying to convince herself that she mattered to a man who'd stated clearly that she didn't. Someone who would make the same mistakes Takeshi had made, which was the thing about cycles. They didn't break just because one person stepped out of the rotation. They continued until the structure itself changed. Takeshi drove north with 2 empty car seats and 2 sleeping children, and the unshakable knowledge that he was about to become the first truly replaceable person to leave before being replaced. And somewhere in downtown Seattle, in an office that overlooked a city he would never return to, Damien Voss was about to discover that some Omegas didn't wait for permission to matter. Some Omegas decided to matter on their own terms, even if it meant becoming ghosts in the process. The freeway opened up ahead of him. The sky burned orange and then gold. The twins slept in the back seat, their tiny hands still reaching for each other across the space between the car seats, and Takeshi drove toward a future that he was building alone, which meant it was already infinitely more secure than anything a man like Damien could have constructed for him. The first sign of a problem came at the Washington-Oregon border, where a state trooper waved him over for a vehicle registration check. Takeshi's hands stayed steady on the wheel even as his pheromones shifted. An Omega couldn't hide a lie. The biological scent would tell everything his mouth refused to say. But an Omega could manipulate context, could lean into the story that his appearance already told. Tired parent, early morning drive, nothing to hide. The trooper looked in the back seat at 2 sleeping children, looked at Takeshi's expensive clothes and the expensive car, looked at everything that suggested stability and parental care. He waved him through without asking questions because nothing in Takeshi's presentation suggested danger. The danger, Takeshi understood, was in being seen clearly. And the most effective way to avoid being seen was to make sure you looked exactly like what people already believed you were. He continued north. The landscape shifted from highway to smaller roads to forest. He'd never been to the town he was heading toward. Bellingham. Small enough not to attract attention, large enough to have infrastructure. He had a rental house on the edge of town, paid in cash through a realtor who dealt with people who preferred confidentiality. He had identification, documents, everything a person would need to disappear. He'd been building this escape route for 4 years, without consciously understanding that's what he was doing. Every separate bank account had been a brick in the wall. Every document kept separate from Damien's system had been another brick. Every contingency plan and backup escape route had been another layer of insulation between himself and the world he was leaving. It took 6 hours to reach Bellingham. The rental house was a small cottage on the outskirts, nothing impressive. Exactly the kind of place an Omega with limited means would rent if they'd fallen on hard times. The porch had a swing. The yard had a fence. The interior had 2 bedrooms upstairs and a kitchen that faced east. It was the opposite of the penthouse in every way except one. It was his. Takeshi carried the twins inside and settled them in one of the upstairs bedrooms, tucking them under blankets that didn't smell like Damien's pheromones. For the first time in their lives, surrounded by an environment that was solely defined by their Omega father's choices, he sat on the edge of the bed and watched them sleep, and felt something in his chest unclench by a fraction. Not relief. Not yet. But the possibility of relief, which was sometimes all an Omega got. The second message from Damien came at 2 in the afternoon. By that time, Takeshi had disabled all remote access to his accounts. By that time, he'd filed the necessary paperwork for a custody arrangement that would be legal as long as Damien didn't know about it. By that time, he was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee watching the yard, and his phone buzzed with a message that read, "This is unacceptable. You need to return to the penthouse immediately." Not a question, not a request. A statement of how the world should work, from a man who'd spent his entire life making it work that way. Takeshi turned his phone off. He didn't destroy it. That would be obvious. He simply shut it down, powered it to darkness, and set it in a drawer where it couldn't vibrate with demands he'd decided not to answer. The twins woke at 3, confused about their surroundings, searching for the specific alpha pheromone signature that had framed their entire existence. Takeshi gathered them both and held them while they cried. And he didn't tell them it was going to be okay because he didn't believe in lying to children. He simply held them and let them feel his presence, which was something he'd been learning to do. Be present in a way that didn't require permission or validation from anyone else. By evening, he'd unpacked the essential things: clothes, food, toys that he'd grabbed at the last moment from the penthouse. He'd set up a temporary life in a temporary house, and the twins had stopped crying and started exploring the way children do, with the resilience of small creatures who adapt because adaptation is the only option available. He was making dinner, simple things, pasta and jarred sauce, when the first attempt came. A car pulled up outside the house. Took made his body go still. Every Omega instinct screamed, "Hide, protect, defend." He moved the twins into the back room, away from the windows. He did not answer the door. He listened as someone knocked, listened as they left, listened to the sound of a car driving away, and he knew before his phone confirmed it that Damien had started looking. It would escalate from here. First, simple location tracking. Then, offers to return. Then, pressure applied to everyone who'd ever meant anything to him. That was how men like Damien worked. They didn't accept the loss of property. And an Omega with his pheromone signature, an Omega who'd borne his children, was absolutely classified as property. Takeshi had prepared for this too. He had contingencies for the contingencies, backup plans for the backup plans, the architectural paranoia of a man who'd learned early that the only safety available to Omegas was the kind you built yourself. The phone call came at midnight. Not from Damien. That would be too direct. From Nakamori Ichiro, Takeshi's older brother. The same brother who'd cut him off 5 years ago when he'd bonded with Damien. The same brother who'd built a career in international law and had made it clear that Takeshi's choices were a personal embarrassment. The same brother who was now on the other end of the line, and his voice carried the unmistakable strain of someone who'd been pressured into making a call they didn't want to make. "Takeshi, you need to come home. Damien's people have been asking questions. They're telling me you left without permission. They're implying that you've taken something that doesn't belong to you." Takeshi felt his heart do something complicated in his chest. "They're threatening you." He kept his voice flat, precise, and Omega's careful neutrality in the face of danger. "Not exactly, but they're making clear that your father would be disappointed to learn about my involvement in harboring a fugitive Omega. That's what they called you. A fugitive. Like you've committed a crime by leaving." Ichiro sounded pained, like he was only just understanding something that should have been obvious to him years ago. "I didn't want to call you. They had my office address. They had my home address. They implied that my daughters might need to understand the consequences of family loyalty." Takeshi gripped the phone so hard his hand shook. "I'm sorry. Don't apologize to me. Apologize to yourself for staying with a man who would threaten children to make a point about property rights." "But Takeshi, they're going to find you. Damien has resources that you don't. This romantic notion that you can just vanish and build a new life. It's not going to work." Takeshi closed his eyes. He'd known this. He'd prepared for this. But knowing something intellectually and hearing it confirmed were different things. The next step of his plan involved moving again. Sawyer and Rowan into the car, into a new town, a new house, a new identity. He'd been hoping for 2 weeks before it became necessary. He'd hoped to give the twins a few days of stability. But Omegas didn't always get what they hoped for. They got what was survivable. Ichiro was still talking, his voice carrying the weight of brotherly obligation and genuine fear. "I could help you. There are lawyers. People who specialize in cases like yours. Custody protections. If you file the right paperwork, make the right allegations, Damien won't be able to touch you." Takeshi wanted to believe that. He wanted to believe in a world where allegations against powerful alphas carried weight, where custody courts prioritized Omega safety, where leaving could be simple instead of complex. But he'd read the contracts Damien had made him sign, had read the fine print about arbitration clauses and non-disclosure agreements, had understood that the legal system, like every other system, was built to protect men like Damien. "I appreciate the offer, but you can't help me if they're watching you. Disconnect from this. Tell them I forced you to help me if they ask. Tell them I manipulated you with my pheromones if you need to. Just make sure my daughters are safe. That's all I'm asking." Ichiro was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I should have listened to you. 4 years ago. I should have told you not to do this. My mistake." And then the line went dead, and Takeshi understood that his brother had just chosen his family, and that family didn't include an Omega who'd decided to prioritize himself. It was the right choice. It was also the choice that meant Takeshi was completely alone now. He woke the twins at 3 in the morning, no panic. He'd learned from his mother that panic could transmit pheromone signals that frightened children. Instead, he made it an adventure. A game. Pack your things, babies. We're going somewhere new. The twins, groggy and confused, obeyed because children obeyed. He put them in the car with their car seats and their stuffed animals and the few belongings he'd managed to transport from Seattle. He left the rental house exactly as it was, wiped of fingerprints, cleaned of every trace. He drove south this time, back toward California, because predictability was a liability and the second act of his disappearance needed to surprise everyone who was looking. By dawn, he was in Portland. By noon, he'd rented a new house under a different name. By evening, the old Takeshi Nakamori had become someone else entirely. The twins were too young to understand the complexity of what was happening, but Rowan, the elder, stayed closer to his father than he had before. And Sawyer, the younger, stopped asking when they were going home. Takeshi understood what this meant. His children were learning what he'd learned decades earlier. Home wasn't a place. Home was wherever you could survive without betraying yourself. And survival, when you were an Omega in a world that believed you were replaceable, sometimes meant becoming a ghost. His phone, powered back on in the new Portland house, held approximately 73 messages from Damien. They started angry, progressed to confused, ended with something that might have been concern if Damien was capable of actual concern instead of just the alpha equivalent of disappointment with a possession. The last message read simply, "You're making a mistake. You need me." And Takeshi understood that this was the cruelest thing an alpha like Damien could believe, that an Omega's survival was dependent on his presence, that an Omega's value was measured in his approval, that an Omega couldn't possibly know how to live in a world that didn't orbit around his pheromones. He deleted all the messages. He didn't reply. He'd already begun the process of erasing digital footprints, of building new lives in small towns where nobody asked questions about single Omega parents with 2 children. He was good at being invisible. He'd been practicing his entire life. The only difference now was that he was invisible on his own terms. The first time Damien tried to contact him through legal channels, it was a discovery motion, an attempt to establish paternity, probably to use the twins as leverage for negotiation. Takeshi's lawyer, a fierce beta woman named Monica Chen, who specialized in Omega custody cases, sent back a response that was legally sound and personally devastating. Damien Voss had waived all parental rights through his own statements and actions. The text message at 3 a.m., combined with the syndicate's subsequent attempts to threaten an Omega's extended family, constituted abandonment with hostile intent. Monica had a copy of security footage from the penthouse, showing Damien's associates removing Takeshi's belongings. She had the threatening messages Damien's people had sent to Ichiro. She had years of digital evidence that painted a picture of an Omega systematically devalued and eventually discarded. The legal response was swift and absolute. Damien could see the children only under supervised visitation, and only if he could prove he was emotionally stable enough to do so. The condition of the case was that he complete a year of therapy addressing his treatment of Omega partners, his legal team argued. They threatened. They tried to leverage every resource available. But Monica had built her case with the precision of someone who'd been fighting this war her entire career, and by the time the dust settled, Damien Voss discovered that money and power, while they could move mountains, couldn't move a properly motivated Omega with legal representation. 6 months after leaving Seattle, Takeshi stopped looking over his shoulder. He'd found work at a sustainable farm cooperative, using his knowledge of agriculture and business to help build systems that supported small farmers. The twins had started school. He'd bought the house he'd been renting, financed it through a bank that didn't ask too many questions about his sudden relocation and employment history. He was building something. Slowly, carefully, with the persistence of someone who'd learned that lasting things required foundation building. Rowan was making friends with the neighbors' children. Sawyer had started speaking more, his shyness fading in an environment where nobody carried the weight of syndicate expectations. Takeshi found himself humming while he washed dishes. It was a small thing, but small things were what Omegas had to celebrate when they chose themselves. The phone call came on a Thursday evening. Monica Chen's voice was professionally neutral, which meant the news was complicated. Damien's asked for a meeting. He claims he wants to discuss visitation. My recommendation is that you ignore it, but I wanted to give you the option to decide for yourself. Takeshi sat with the phone pressed to his ear and felt something twist in his stomach. Not fear. He'd moved beyond fear. Something else. Curiosity, maybe, or the morbid desire to understand how the story would end. I'll listen, but not in person. If he wants to talk, he can do it through video. Monica sighed. I can arrange that. But Takeshi, I want to be clear about something. The man who loved you and the man who abandoned you might not be the same person, and meeting with him, even through a screen, might complicate your healing. I know, but I think I need to hear what he has to say. So Takeshi agreed, and 1 week later, he sat in Monica's office with his lawyer beside him and a camera pointed at his face, and he waited. The screen flickered. Damien appeared. He looked older. Like the last 6 months had been harder on him than they'd been on Takeshi, which probably meant they had been, because men like Damien weren't built for loss. He looked directly at the camera, at Takeshi, and said, I want my family back, just like that. No preamble, no apology, just a statement of desire, presented as though it was already inevitable. Takeshi felt something crystallize in his chest. Monica leaned forward, ready to end the call if needed. But Takeshi raised a hand. What do you want? He'd never asked this of Damien before, had accepted the Alpha's decisions as though they were natural laws rather than choices. Now he asked, genuinely curious, what do you want from us? The question seemed to stun Damien for a moment. Then, I want to be the person I was supposed to be, the man who could have been for you. I didn't know that you were waiting for me to choose you. I thought you were just going to absorb my choices and adapt, the way Omegas do. I thought you knew you were replaceable, so you'd work harder not to be. I thought. He trailed off. Takeshi waited, and after a long moment, Damien continued. I was wrong. My entire framework for understanding what we had was built on something broken. I thought if you were easy to replace, you were easy to control. But you weren't easy to replace because you were already irreplaceable. You left, and there was no one to replace you with because the person I needed wasn't someone I could just substitute. It was you. It was always you. Takeshi felt tears slide down his face, which surprised him. He'd thought he was done with tears about Damien Voss. I can't go back. He kept his voice steady. My children need stability. They need to know that their Omega father is a person who makes choices and lives by them. I can't teach them that if I return to someone who made clear that we weren't worth the effort of choosing consciously. Damien's expression cracked. I understand. Monica leaned back slightly, her body language shifting from defensive to neutral. And what I'm here to tell you is that I've transferred the penthouse deed to your name. There's a trust set up for the twins, and I'm stepping away from the syndicate. I'm going to spend the next 5 years building something that looks like redemption. And if you ever decide that you want to know the person I'm becoming, there's a place for you in that story. But I know I don't deserve that. I just wanted you to know that you were wrong about one thing. You were never replaceable. And I spent 6 months finally understanding that. Takeshi didn't respond. He ended the call. He sat with Monica for a long moment, processing. Then he stood up and left the office and drove home to his twins, who were waiting for him with construction paper and drawings of houses and flowers and all the small, stable things that Omegas built when they decided they were worth building for. That night he sat on the porch of his house and watched the Oregon sunset and understood something fundamental about the architecture of his own life. He'd left believing that being valued by an alpha was the only way to matter. It had taken everything he had to build, meaning that existed independent of Damien's approval. And now, when that approval finally came, when Damien finally understood what he'd thrown away, Takeshi realized it didn't change anything. He was already whole. He was already complete. He was already irreplaceable, not because an alpha had decided it, but because he'd decided it himself. The twins fell asleep inside. Takeshi remained on the porch, and when his phone buzzed with a message from Monica saying that Damien wanted to know if supervised visitation was still off the table, Takeshi texted back, "Tell him the twins can meet their father when they're old enough to choose. Until then, he's a stranger who needs to learn what it means to build relationships instead of collect them." He turned off his phone. He watched the stars come out above his house. And for the first time in 6 months, for the first time in 4 years before that, for the first time in his entire life, Takeshi Nakamori felt the weight of being an Omega, not as a liability, but as a choice. The choice to love himself first. The choice to demand better. The choice to walk away from anyone who couldn't see that walking away was the bravest thing an Omega could do. His car sat in the driveway with empty car seats in the back. But they weren't empty anymore. They held the weight of two children who carried his blood and his choices and his fierce, quiet insistence that mattering didn't require anyone else's permission. He was replaceable the moment he'd started to believe it, and irreplaceable the moment he stopped. The redemption arc looked like this: therapy sessions, a genuine attempt to dismantle the syndicate. The penthouse deed transferred to Takeshi's name, which he never visited, never acknowledged, and never used. 6 months of silence followed by a birthday gift for the twins sent through Monica that Takeshi accepted into his house and set in the closet without opening. Rowan found it eventually, the way children do. He carried it to his father with the seriousness of someone who understood that objects could carry weight beyond their mass. "What is it?" Rowan asked, his dark eyes carrying the same calculation that Damien had perfected over a lifetime of reading rooms and people. "A gift. From the man who is your biological father." Rowan sat with this information the way he sat with everything, cautiously, waiting for the context that would make sense of it. Did he send it because he loves us or because he feels bad? That question destroyed something in Takeshi's chest. He gathered his son and held him and realized that even at 7 years old, Rowan had learned to distinguish between love and guilt, between genuine change and performance. "Both can be true," Takeshi said finally. "He can feel bad and still love you. Loving someone and hurting them aren't mutually exclusive. But the hurt you cause should make you change, not just make you sorry. I think he's trying to change. But change is harder than gift-giving, so it might take a very long time." Rowan nodded and carried the unopened gift back to the closet, and Takeshi understood that his children had inherited something from both parents. The Omega Father's practical assessment of reality, and the Alpha Father's capacity to recognize value when they finally saw it clearly. 2 years into the life they'd built in Oregon, Takeshi had stopped looking at his bank account with the paranoia of someone expecting it to be seized. The farmland cooperative had become successful. He'd become known in the community as the quiet Omega who understood systems and building and how to make small things thrive. He'd built friendships that had nothing to do with alpha connection or pheromone compatibility. He'd built a life. The twins had started to forget what Seattle smelled like. Sawyer spoke less about the penthouse and more about his favorite tree on the property. Rowan had developed a fierce interest in agriculture, spending hours following Takeshi through the work with the focus of someone who'd inherited his father's methodical approach to building things. It was good. It was stable. It was exactly what Takeshi had escaped into being. So when Damien showed up at the farm on a Tuesday morning, Takeshi's first instinct wasn't fear. It was a calculation of logistics. How had he found them? What he wanted? Whether his presence constituted a threat or a complication. The second instinct was recognition, because Damien Voss had changed in ways that were visible even from a distance. He was thinner. The sharp edges of his face had softened into something that looked like actual humanity. He moved differently, less like a predator and more like someone who'd learned that predation came with consequences. He was wearing jeans. Takeshi realized this was shocking to him. He'd never seen Damien in anything but tailored suits, and the kind of casual luxury that cost more than it appeared to cost. Jeans looked like surrender on him. "Looks like someone's been doing the work," Monica had said in their last conversation. "His therapist has cleared him for supervised contact. He's asking if you'd consider it." Takeshi had said no. But no in a context of maybe, which was the thing about Omegas. They were always holding space for maybe, even when they knew better. So, when Damien pulled into the farm drive, Takeshi wasn't entirely surprised. He was just unprepared. The twins were at school. Takeshi was working in the greenhouse, hands in soil, building systems for vertical gardens that would maximize yield and minimize waste. He heard the truck before he saw it. Heard Damien cut the engine and sit in the driver's seat like he was gathering courage for something. Takeshi didn't turn around. He continued with his work, continued to build, continued to occupy space that didn't require Damien's presence to justify itself. When Damien finally exited the truck, his pheromones were carefully controlled. That was new, too. In Seattle, Damien had broadcast his presence through scent the way other people breathed. Now his pheromones were modulated, contained, respectful in a way they'd never been before. "I know you didn't give permission for me to come here," Damien said. "I know I'm violating the terms of our arrangement. But I needed to see this. Needed to see what you built." Takeshi finally turned, His hands were dirty, his clothes were work clothes. He looked nothing like he had in the penthouse, and the expression on Damien's face suggested that this was important, that the Omega in work clothes building systems in a greenhouse was more real to him than the Omega in designer clothes had ever been. "I'm not here to ask for anything," Damien continued. "I'm here to tell you that you were right. About everything. I spent 2 years being an alpha who believed that control and love were the same thing. I spent the first year of therapy understanding that they absolutely are not. And I've spent the last 6 months building the kind of life where I might have been capable of letting you choose without needing to manage the choice. But you'd already left, so I've been choosing for both of us. I chose to leave the syndicate. I chose to dismantle the parts of the operation that hurt people like you. I chose to become the person I should have been from the beginning, and none of it matters because I did it wrong again. I did it for the right reasons, but in the wrong way. I decided who I should be instead of asking you what you needed me to be." Takeshi set down his tools. He studied Damien with the Omega's capacity to see through performance to the genuine architecture underneath. "Are you here to convince me to come back?" "No. I don't believe you can come back to something that was built on the wrong foundation. But I'm here to ask if you'll let me know you. Not as Damien Voss who owns things, not as the Alpha who paired with you. Just as the man who made a catastrophic mistake and wants to understand what that mistake cost you." Takeshi walked out of the greenhouse. He walked past Damien. He walked to the edge of the property where the land opened into fields he was restoring from agricultural waste to native species. Damien followed, respecting the silence. The walk took 20 minutes. They didn't speak. When they reached the overlook, Takeshi turned to face the man who'd spent 4 years being the center of his world and who now occupied the margins, waiting to be invited back or accepted as disappeared. "It cost me everything," Takeshi said simply. "It cost me the belief that I was worth choosing consciously. It cost me the twins their certainty that alphas could be trusted. It cost me 4 years of my life, and 2 years of building from nothing before I stopped having nightmares about being found and forced back. It cost me every friendship I'd built before you entered my life because I was too afraid to maintain connections that weren't monitored. It cost me my relationship with my brother because protecting him meant cutting him off. It cost me my capacity to trust my own judgment. I spent years believing that because I chose you, my choice was inherently flawed, and I needed to hide from it rather than honor it. You took my agency and dressed it up as security, and I was too young and too Omega to recognize that I was trading my future for your certainty." Damien listened without defending. "That's what changed for me," he said finally. "Understanding that I never asked you what you wanted from certainty. I just decided what certainty should look like and expected you to fit inside it." Takeshi felt something shift in his chest. Not forgiveness. He wasn't ready for that yet. But acknowledgement. The recognition that Damien was attempting something genuine, and that attempt, however imperfect, was worth something. "I need to talk to the twins first. Before anything else happens, they need to understand what this means. And they need to decide if meeting you is something they want, not something that happens to them because you decided it was time." Damien nodded. "I understand." The meeting happened 2 weeks later. Not at the farm. Neutral territory. A park in Portland where children played and alphas couldn't easily dominate the landscape through pheromones alone. Takeshi brought the twins. Monica came too, keeping a professional distance but present. A reminder that Takeshi wasn't alone in this negotiation. Rowan was 7. He'd learned to read his father's emotional state through pheromones like a sophisticated instrument. He understood that Takeshi was nervous but not afraid, hopeful but not certain. When Damien approached, Rowan stood without being prompted and extended his hand with the formal precision of someone who'd learned manners from a father who'd made precision necessary. "Hello, I'm Rowan. This is my brother Sawyer." Sawyer was 5. He hid behind Takeshi's leg until Rowan's formality gave him permission to emerge. Then he stepped forward with the trusting vulnerability of the younger child, who'd learned his lessons from his father's example. Wait, assess, then choose. "You're big," Sawyer observed simply. Damien, faced with his 2 biological children for the first time outside of photographs and memory, knelt. He made himself small. He made himself accessible. His pheromones stayed controlled. He smiled, and it was a real smile, not the predatory arrangement of facial muscles Takeshi had seen 1,000 times before. I'm Damien, and I'm very glad to meet both of you properly." Rowan studied him with an alpha's natural instinct to assess power dynamics. Are you going to try to take us away from our dad? That question, asked by a 7-year-old with the seriousness of someone who understood the stakes, seemed to crack something open in Damien. No, he said immediately. Your father is exactly where each of you should be. I'm here because I want to know you. Not to own you, not to control your life, just to understand what my choices created and to be present with that instead of running from it. Sawyer was satisfied by this answer. He climbed into Damien's lap without hesitation, the way young children do when they sense genuine warmth, and for 20 minutes, Takeshi watched his youngest son interact with his biological father like it was completely normal, completely safe. Rowan remained more cautious. He asked questions. Where do you live now? Why did you leave our dad? What does business mean? What is a syndicate and why did you stop doing it? Damien answered each question with honesty that bordered on brutal. He explained that he'd been building power instead of building family. He explained that he'd made mistakes that had hurt people. He explained that understanding those mistakes, truly understanding them, had taken years of work and had changed everything about how he moved through the world. By the end of the 2 hours, Rowan had thought enough to ask, "Do you want to see us again?" Damien glanced at Takeshi. "I want to see you as often as your father thinks is healthy for you. I don't want to demand. I don't want to make decisions about your life. I just want to know you if you'll let me." Rowan and Sawyer exchanged a glance, the kind of twin communication that had no words but carried all the meaning. "Then yes, but you have to ask our dad first, every time, because he's the one who makes decisions for us." Damien's expression shifted. Something that looked like genuine humility. "Of course. That's exactly right." And so began the slow architecture of a new relationship, not reconciliation with Takeshi. That remained delicate, complicated, uncertain. But introduction, connection. The building of something that existed separate from the ruins of what had come before. Damien came to the farm every 2 weeks. He brought the twins, and he helped with the work. He learned about systems and growing things. He learned what it looked like when an Omega built something with his own hands and refused to apologize for the beauty it created. He learned that Rowan was methodical and strategic like his biological father, but with an Omega's capacity for connection and relationship. He learned that Sawyer was intuitive and empathetic, the kind of child who understood people on sight and wasn't afraid of vulnerability. He learned that Takeshi was the architect of both of those qualities, had given his children the best parts of himself and the worst parts of knowing an alpha, and had somehow managed to transform that into something resilient and whole. The conversations deepened over time. Not apologies, because apologies become complicated when they're requested repeatedly, but honesty. Damien told the twins about his childhood, about the alpha training that had taught him that control was synonymous with love, about the years it took to understand that love and control were actually opposed. He told them about the syndicate, carefully, age-appropriately, but without hiding the reality that their biological father had been a person who hurt people and had finally chosen not to be that person anymore. Rowan, at 8, asked if that meant Damien was safe. Damien's answer was, "I'm safer now than I was before, but I'll probably always have the capacity to hurt people. The question is whether I choose to. Every day." That answer seemed to satisfy Rowan, because it was honest, because it didn't pretend that redemption was complete or permanent or could ever make everything okay. It just acknowledged that change was a daily practice, not a destination. 18 months after Damien's first visit to the farm, Takeshi found himself in an unexpected situation. His alpha was asking him to dinner, not as a negotiation, not as an attempt to reconcile, just as two people who had a history and were curious about what a new chapter might look like. Takeshi's instinct was to refuse, but Monica, now something closer to a friend than a lawyer, challenged him. "You've let him into your children's lives. You've let him into your work. You've let him be present in the margins. Why not let him be present in the one space you've kept entirely private?" "Because the private space is where I might forgive him," Takeshi said. "And forgiveness might make me stupid," Monica smiled. "Or it might make you human." The dinner happened at a restaurant in Portland that had nothing to do with the syndicate, nothing to do with power, nothing to do with anything except food and two people sitting across from each other. Damien looked nervous. That was new. In Seattle, Damien had never been nervous. He'd been certain in a way that was almost boring in its consistency. Now he looked like a man on a first date, which he supposed this was. A first date after years of damage and repair and the slow construction of something that might become something else. They talked about the farm, about the twins, about Damien's work now, which involved rebuilding communities that the syndicate had damaged. It was quiet work. No glamour, no power accumulation. Just the slow practice of making amends in a world that rarely required amends from people like him, and somewhere in the middle of dessert, Takeshi felt something shift. Not forgiveness, still, but the possibility of it, the recognition that Damien was actually changing, not performing change, that the man across from him had genuinely spent years unmaking himself and remaking something different, and that maybe, possibly, that deserved something more than distance. After dinner, Damien walked Takeshi to his car. He didn't try to touch him. He didn't presume. He simply said, "Thank you for taking a risk on me tonight. I know I haven't earned the right to ask for risks, but I'm grateful you took it anyway." Takeshi found himself asking the question he'd been avoiding for 2 years. "Do you think we can ever go back to what we had?" Damien was quiet for a long moment. "No. What we had was built on something broken. I don't think we can rebuild that, but I think we could build something new. Something where I'm not making your choices and you're not hiding pieces of yourself. Something where love is actually a choice instead of a biological fact. Would you want that?" Takeshi wanted to say yes immediately. The Omega part of him, the part that had been shaped by years of socialization, wanted to accept an Alpha's attempt at redemption and move back into the orbit of being chosen. But the Omega who'd built a life alone, who'd proven he didn't need an Alpha's validation to matter, who'd learned that choosing himself was the most important choice he'd ever made, that Omega hesitated. "I need time to see if this is real or if it's another version of you deciding who I should be. To make sure that my children understand that their father's choice to try to rebuild with their biological father isn't a betrayal of everything we've built. To know that if I choose you again, it's because I'm choosing you, not because I've reverted to old patterns." Damien nodded. "I can wait. I've had 2 years to wait already. I can wait as long as you need." Over the next 6 months, Takeshi allowed Damien into his life in slow, deliberate increments. Coffee dates became dinner dates. Dinner dates became weekends where Damien came to the farm and stayed in a guest cottage they'd set up for visiting colleagues. Weekends became something that looked almost like partnership, with Damien learning to work alongside Takeshi instead of directing, to consult instead of command, to respect the systems that Takeshi had built. The twins seemed to accept this new configuration without much fanfare. Rowan, now 9, was analytical about it. "If you're going to try again, you should try it right, not like before." Sawyer, 7, was simply happy to have his biological father more present. Children were capable of compartmentalization in ways that adults often weren't. Takeshi watched Sawyer hug Damien and simultaneously hug Takeshi and not need the two relationships to be mutually exclusive, and he felt something shift in his understanding of what forgiveness could look like. It didn't have to be all-consuming. It didn't have to mean forgetting what had happened. It could just mean allowing two truths to exist simultaneously, that Damien had been harmful and that Damien was trying to be different, that the past had been painful and the future might be otherwise. 2 years after Damien first showed up at the farm, Takeshi stood in the farmhouse kitchen making coffee for them both, and he realized he wasn't running anymore. He wasn't building an escape route. He wasn't compartmentalizing or preparing contingencies or holding parts of himself in reserve. He was simply standing in his kitchen with a man who'd broken him and was attempting repair, and he was allowing that repair to happen. Damien entered, kissed the top of his head, and asked how the irrigation system was coming along. Takeshi answered. They moved through the morning like people who had a history and were building toward a future that neither could entirely predict. The twins came down, still half asleep, demanding breakfast. Sawyer demanded pancakes specifically. Rowan demanded that Damien help because Damien made better pancakes. Damien, caught off guard by this statement, laughed and tied an apron and enlisted Takeshi as assistant, and for the first time in 3 years, the foursome existed in a space that felt like family rather than negotiation. It was imperfect. Damien still sometimes slipped into old patterns of assuming, and Takeshi still had triggers that made him retreat. They fought. Real fights, where Takeshi's Omega instinct to capitulate had to war with his hard-won insistence on being heard. Real fights where Damien's alpha nature wanted to dominate the disagreement, and he had to consciously choose partnership instead. But they kept fighting, They kept choosing, and slowly, the structure of their relationship shifted from one built on the assumption that Takeshi was replaceable into one built on the certainty that Takeshi was essential. 3 years after Takeshi left Seattle with 2 car seats and 2 children, Damien proposed. Not in a grand gesture. Not in a way that required Takeshi to say yes immediately or lose the romantic moment. Simply on a Tuesday morning while they were working in the greenhouse. "I don't want to be your boyfriend," Damien said. "I don't want to be the man you're testing. I want to be your husband, the one you chose consciously, the one you're building toward instead of building away from." Takeshi held the seedling he was planting. He took time with his answer. He didn't rush it the way his Omega training had taught him to rush decisions that alphas wanted made. "I need to think about this. I need to make sure that saying yes means something different than it meant before. I need to know that I'm choosing you for reasons that have to do with who you are now, not gratitude for who you're trying to become." Damien smiled. "That's exactly the answer I needed to hear. It means you're taking the choice seriously. It means you're honoring what you learned about yourself while you were gone. That's everything I'm asking for." The answer came 3 weeks later. Takeshi had spent the time making sure that choosing Damien again was a choice made by the man he'd become, not the Omega he'd been before. Making sure that the twins were comfortable with it, that they understood what marriage meant in the context of their lives. Making sure that his own reasons were solid and not born from habit or biological imperative or the socialization that told him an Omega's value was measured in an Alpha's commitment. Then he said yes. The wedding happened quietly. Small ceremony, just the twins and Monica and a few close friends from the farm cooperative. Takeshi wore a suit that he'd chosen himself. Damien wore one that matched. They exchanged rings that Takeshi had designed. Not symbols of ownership, but symbols of choice. 2 rings interlocking but separate, each maintaining its own integrity. The vows they wrote were specific and ungrandiose. Takeshi promised to call Damien out if he slipped back into old patterns. Damien promised to listen instead of defend. Both promised to keep choosing, every day, in ways both small and enormous. After the ceremony, driving back to the farm with the twins asleep in the back seat, Takeshi felt something like peace. Not the absence of fear or struggle or the occasional moment where old patterns threatened to resurface, but the peace that came from knowing that he'd built something real, something that had survived being broken and had chosen to repair itself. The farm grew. The twins thrived. Damien built a new career in community restoration, using the resources and connections he still possessed to repair the damage he'd done. Takeshi became known in agricultural circles as someone who understood systems at the deepest level, someone who could look at a broken landscape and see the possibility of restoration. They built a life together that was both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary in its dailiness, coffee and work and helping with homework and making dinner. Extraordinary in its meaning, 2 people who had walked through devastation and chosen to rebuild not just their relationship but their entire understanding of what love could mean. 5 years after Takeshi left Seattle with 2 car seats and 2 sleeping children, Rowan and Sawyer were 12 and 10. They understood their history in the way children understood complicated family dynamics, with a matter-of-factness that their parents both envied and protected. Rowan, particularly, had inherited the Nakamori family's capacity for strategic thinking. He understood that his father had been harmed and had chosen to leave rather than be continuously harmed. He understood that his biological father had been harmful and had chosen to change. He understood that rebuilding was possible but not inevitable and required constant effort from everyone involved. Sawyer was simpler. He loved both his fathers in an uncomplicated way, moving between them with the ease of a child who'd learned that families could look multiple different ways and still be real. One evening, Rowan asked Takeshi a question while they were working in the greenhouse together. "Do you ever regret leaving?" Takeshi set down his tools. "It's a complicated regret. I regret the pain it caused. I regret the years where I was terrified and isolated. I regret that your brother and I lost time with Damien during those years. But I don't regret leaving. Leaving was the thing that taught me I mattered. Leaving was the thing that made it possible for me to come back to Damien on different terms. I don't think I would have been able to rebuild with him if I hadn't first rebuilt with myself." Rowan nodded. "That makes sense. In my school, people are always talking about soulmates like they're just waiting somewhere. But you had to make yourself into someone who could be with a soulmate instead of just accepting someone who called themselves your soulmate. That's actually really hard." Takeshi pulled his son close. It is, but it's also the only way to build something real. The easy way, the way that society tells you is the right way, is to find someone and fit yourself inside their choices. The hard way, the way that actually works, is to build yourself first and then invite someone to build alongside you. Rowan seemed to absorb this. Then he asked, "Do you think Damien would have changed if you hadn't left?" That question sat between them for a long moment. "Honestly, I don't know. But I know that me staying wouldn't have changed him. He needed to understand what it meant to lose something irreplaceable. He needed to understand that power wasn't the same as love. He needed to understand that redemption was a daily practice, not a destination. I couldn't teach him those things. I could only model them by leaving." Rowan nodded again. Then he said, "I'm going to remember this. When I'm older and I'm choosing people to build my life with, I'm going to remember that my dad left, and that was brave, and that rebuilding was also brave. I'm going to remember that how you start isn't how you have to end." Takeshi felt tears slide down his face. He didn't try to hide them or apologize for them. He simply held his son and acknowledged that Rowan had understood something fundamental about the architecture of their lives, that Takeshi's leaving hadn't been an ending. It had been a beginning. The story didn't conclude with Damien and Takeshi disappearing into a sunset of domestic bliss. Real life was more complex than that. There were setbacks, moments where Damien's old patterns resurfaced and had to be addressed. Moments where Takeshi retreated because fear was a deeper well than he'd anticipated. They went to therapy, both together and separately. They fought. They made up. They learned constantly what it meant to build a relationship on the foundation of conscious choice rather than biological or social convenience. But they built it, and what they built had the integrity of something constructed by people who understood what it meant to almost lose each other, what it meant to choose to try again, what it meant to let an Omega decide his own value. 5 years after the wedding, 10 years after that 3 a.m. text message that had fractured everything, Takeshi stood on the porch of the farmhouse watching Damien help the twins harvest the gardens they'd planted together. The car seats were long gone, replaced by bikes and the normal equipment of growing children's lives. The penthouse in Seattle had been donated to a community center that served Omegas in transition, a practical application of Damien's resources toward something real. The syndicate was fully dismantled, its resources redirected toward legitimate business and community building. Takeshi had become something like famous in certain circles. The Omega, who'd walked away and built something beautiful. Sometimes he was asked for interviews, for his story, for advice about leaving dangerous alphas. He gave all of it freely, without apology, because he understood that his story was ammunition for other Omegas who needed to know that leaving was possible, that rebuilding was possible, that being replaceable by someone else didn't mean you were actually replaceable. The Omega who had left with 2 car seats hadn't been looking for a redemption arc. He'd been looking for security, for value, for proof that mattering to someone was the same as being worthy. Instead, he'd learned that mattering to yourself came first. Everything else was negotiable. Everything else was optional. Everything else was chosen, not given. Damien had learned something different. That power was empty without intimacy. That control was hollow without genuine connection. That the most meaningful thing he'd ever built wasn't an empire, but the trust that one Omega had finally decided to place in him again. They built a life that looked ordinary on the surface. Farm, children, regular jobs and regular struggles and regular Tuesday mornings making coffee together. But underneath was the extraordinary architecture of 2 people who had walked through devastation and chosen every day to rebuild. Who had understood that redemption wasn't a moment, it was a practice. Who had accepted that some wounds never fully healed but became the foundation for something stronger. Takeshi never fully forgot what it felt like to be replaceable, but he learned that being replaceable by someone else and being irreplaceable to yourself were completely different things. One was about the failure of someone else's vision. The other was about the success of your own. He chose the second. Damien chose to support the second. And together, they built something that neither of them could have built alone. A life that wasn't about dominance or submission, but partnership. A life where an Omega's choices mattered. A life where an Alpha's redemption was measured not in grand gestures, but in small daily decisions to respect, to listen, to honor the person he'd almost destroyed. The last scene happens at the farm during the twins' 14th and 12th birthday celebration. Extended family is present. Ichiro, Takeshi's brother, who'd finally reconciled after years of estrangement. Monica, who'd become family in the way that people who fight with you sometimes do, friends from the community, Damien's legitimate family, who'd had to come to terms with his transformation, the twins' open presents. Damien gave them both bonds to college funds. Takeshi gave them both journals with a note. Write your truths in these. Write the things you don't say out loud. Write the life you're building. Because watching you build your own lives is the greatest gift you could give me. Rowan, at 14, hugged his Omegaverse fiercely. Sawyer, at 12, did the same, and Damien stood at the periphery of the celebration, watching his sons with the expression of a man who understood that his greatest gift wasn't giving them security. It was giving them a father who'd had the humility to admit he'd been wrong, and the courage to spend years proving he'd changed. That night, after the twins were asleep, Takeshi and Damien sat on the porch together, not with the desperate need of early reunion, but with the comfortable silence of people who had built something real. Damien reached over and took Takeshi's hand, and there was no ownership in the gesture, just connection, just the acknowledgement that they'd both survived something that should have destroyed them and had chosen to rebuild instead. "Do you ever wish you'd stayed?" Damien asked. "No," Takeshi answered. "Leaving was the thing that made everything real, including this. This wouldn't exist if I hadn't left. And I need this to exist more than I needed security. I need to know that I'm here because I chose to be, not because I didn't have the strength to leave." Damien squeezed his hand. "Then I'm grateful for everything you left, because it brought you back." And that, Takeshi understood, was what redemption actually looked like. Not the absence of damage, but the presence of repair. Not the erasure of harm, but the commitment to something different. Not the reversal of time, but the conscious building of a future that honored what had happened and refused to be defined by it. He was replaceable the moment he'd started to believe it, and irreplaceable the moment he'd chosen himself. And somewhere in the space between those two moments, between leaving and returning, between breaking and rebuilding, he'd found something that no amount of security could have given him. The knowledge that his life was his own, his choices were his own, and his value didn't depend on anyone else's certainty.